Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today I'm going to be doing a video about understanding the origin of Judaism type religious movements. So to begin today's topic, it's a bit of a challenge for me because I wanted to try to do this as respectfully as possible, while at the same time being accurate in terms of what the historical issues are concerning movements that you can term as either Judaism type movements or Judaism style movements, or as Judaism to begin with. And one of the challenges that presents is because of the word Judaism being an English word for the most part, that has that Hebrew equivalent, but it doesn't mean exactly what people today usually mean by Judaism. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing what I discuss a lot in my videos, and is concerning the topic of, first of all, what is Torath Mosheh? Because before you can get into this issue, you have to first understand what Torath Mosheh is and what it's not, and how various movements got started that are, in a sense, outside of that spectrum. So the next thing that's going to be talked about in this video is what are the sources of the various type of Judaism style movements, and also I'll be explaining why I use that terminology, Judaism style movements. And then the last thing is going to be discussing what is the difference between Torath Mosheh and religious Judaism. And I put religious in quotation marks for a very important reason, which I'll also be discussing later in the video. Okay, so the first obvious thing we have to do is determine, okay, the truth. What is Torath Mosheh? I guess specific area for me because of the fact that I've been involved in a number of numerous discussions, as well as I was interviewed recently, where the issue came up when someone asked me, for example, what exactly religious practices do you say you hold? And I was like, well, I don't hold by the concept of religion, I hold by Torath Mosheh. And from there, the discussion went in a certain direction because of the fact that I was mentioning Torath Mosheh. Now, so that brings the question, well, what exactly is Torath Mosheh? Well, first, to understand it, we have to even look at the statement and say, well, what does it even look like in Hebrew? So this is what we read, Torath Mosheh. We read Hebrew from right to left. So the first part of the word or the statement is Torah. And the reason why it's called Torath is because at the situation where you're trying to say the Torah of something, you would have to add in this form a tav at the end of it. The tav is what's in parentheses at the end of this part here. And when you say Torath, it means Torah of. So the next part is Moshe. Moshe, of course, is the actual name of Moshe Rabbeinu, or in English people say Moses. Of course, the reason why people say Moses in English is generally because in the Greek language, when they were translating Hebrew text, they didn't have the shin or the sh sound. They only had a s sound. So they were calling Moshe, or Moshe in ancient Hebrew, Moses or Moshe. So the next thing, when we deal with what is Torath Mosheh, it's often termed as a lot of different things when you look at Hebrew text, text of the Tanakh, as well as Jewish writing that is all written in Hebrew. And sometimes it's termed as Torath Hashem, meaning the Torah of Hashem, the creator of all things, or Torath Amet, the Torah of truth. And the first instance where you have this actual statement mentioned in this way, in this specific way, is mentioned in the book of the prophet, the Navi, Malachi, where he basically mentions, Zichru Torath Moshe Abdi, Asher Tziwithi Otho B'Horev Al Kol Bnei Yisrael Hogem Mishpatim. So translating that, this is Malachi 3:22, and essentially what he says is, remember Torath Moshe Abdi, my servant, which was commanded to you. This was talking about the people of Israel. Oto B'Horev, in a place called Horev, Al Kol Yisrael Hogem Mishpatim. So essentially what he's saying is, remember the Torath Moshe, of my servant Moshe, and his Torah, the Torah that he gave, which was commanded to all the people of Israel, the people of Am Yisrael, at Horev, which is also like Har Sinai, Hokim Mishpatim, so basically it's like statutes and laws. So this is the essential point of Torath Moshe. So when dealing with this issue, the first question I always like to present to people is we have to deal with, when we deal with the question of historical events, we have to look at what I would term as the singularity. The singularity meaning at what point do these ideas and concepts start? Because there has to be a starting point. It isn't like some of these things are just all around forever, blah, blah, blah. At some point they start, and at some point they have a starting point that you could say, okay, this is the point from which we begin. And when we deal with the analysis of history, we always have to find that singularity in order to understand, well, what is the correct way of viewing this? So the singularity in terms of the Torah, in terms of Torath Mosheh, is when the Torah was given at Har Sinai, or at Mount Sinai. During that time, what we're told, this is also the history of all of the people of Am Yisrael, is that the people of Israel, Yisrael, who were in Mitzrayim, left Mitzrayim. They were led by Moshe Rabbeinu. They left under some conditions where basically a number of you could say like events, like events of like kind of beyond the realm of nature, brought down the kingdom of Mitzrayim during that time. They were led through the desert and ended up in a place called Har Sinai. And at Har Sinai, essentially, there was a certain point where they were told to be prepared, and Moshe Rabbeinu went down with him, and he was with them, at that point. And the mountain started to like show signs of like being almost like on fire. There was lightning, there was a lot of different natural events, and then they heard a shofar, and all of a sudden they heard the voice of the Creator speaking. Now, there are some sources that say they heard the voice of like, almost like a million voices speaking. There's other sources that say it was almost as if like water was crashing against like, rocks and things like that, that it was just so much of an experience that the people basically ran back and said, Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, you talk to the Creator because this is too much. And during that time, the Creator said 10 things. One source saying, for example, that the Creator spoke all of the 10 things, the Esrei Tadibrut, the 10 commands that people would say, all at once, and that the people heard all of them at once, and then he went one by one. And that when they got to the second one, that Moshe Rabbeinu, was there, and then the people said, okay, you talk to Hashem and tell us what he said, we'll stay back here because this is too much. But the basic inference here is that the singularity is that the people of Israel heard the voice of the Creator, and there are some sources that say that everybody saw the voice of the Creator also. So that means that everybody who went there had no discrepancy about what took place at that moment. They all saw the same thing, experienced the same thing. And you're talking about basically almost like 1 million people or more who experienced the situation. So it isn't like one person coming and saying, or Moshe Rabbeinu coming and saying, the Creator said all these 10 things, and he showed me lightning and all this kind of stuff. People say, well, we weren't there. We didn't. How do we know that's what happened? The basic singularity of Torath Mosheh is this event when all of the people of Israel experienced the same situation and heard the voice of the Creator and saw the voice of the Creator at Har Sinai, and walked away from the experience with the same history about what took place. So getting to this point in more detail, what the Torah tells us a little bit later on after Hashem spoke is V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot. So basically all the people saw the kolot. So there's one interpretation where this is like lightning that they saw. Another resource says that they basically saw the voice of the Creator, that the kolot is like they saw the voice, because it says v'chol ha'am ro'im. Ro'im means seeing. And it's seeing in present tense, for example. V'chol ha'am ro'im et kolot. So all the people are seeing the kolot. Et lapadim. So lapadim is almost like a type of like fire. Sometimes it's like describing like torches that are being lit, and that basically the mountain was on fire itself. Et kol shofar. So the shofar was almost like a sound, like a horn being blown. It's like a ram's horn. So they heard that kind of sound too during this whole experience. That was happening. Et hahar olshein. So essentially the mountain was like smoking. So this is the event that all of the people of Israel saw. And this is the singularity, so that everyone walked away with this same experience. So when you go to any Jewish community, any ancient Jewish community, what you're going to find is that they have the same historical singularity that is found amongst all of them. Now, concerning this point of what came after that point, in the Mishnah Torah, in the introduction, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon wrote the following. Kol ha-mitzvot shenatanu lo Moshe b'Sinai. So all of the mitzvot, they were basically given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. V'chol Torah katvu Moshe Rabbeinu kodem sheyamut b'chatav yado v'natan sefer lechol shevet v'shevet v'siper echad shenatanuhu be'aron le'ed. So essentially what this is telling us is that all of the Torah was given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. And basically all of the Torah he wrote, essentially, before he passed away, and he wrote it with his own hand, himself. And he gave a copy of this Sefer Torah that he wrote to every of the leaders of every tribe, every Shevet HaShevet. And then he also placed one copy of it to be placed in the Aron. That was amongst the Kohanim and the Levim, so for them to also keep. So essentially from there, all copies of the Sefer Torah that he wrote, all the copies of the Torah that he wrote, the actual written text of the Torah he wrote, was passed down from those original texts that he made, which were 13 texts that he wrote himself. And the people made copies from those 13 texts, and the master copy was kept amongst the Kohanim, the Leviim, in the Beit HaMikdash, or in the Mishkan at the time. Now, this is also repeated by the Ramban. The Ramban, in his Pirush of the Torah, which is like his commentary on the Torah, of Bereshit, This is Ramban. Ramban is Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. So what he wrote is the following. Moshe Rabbeinu katav hasefer hazeh im haTorah kulo mipiv shel hakadosh baruch hu. So when speaking about Bereshit, he's saying that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote this portion of this book with the Torah, all of the entire Torah, from basically the words of Hashem. So Hashem told him exactly what to write. He wrote it exactly. If Hashem told him to write, put a space here, Moshe Rabbeinu put a space there. He didn't create anything on his own. Essentially, the whole format of the Torah was what Hashem wanted, the Creator himself wanted, and Moshe Rabbeinu basically just transcribed whatever the Hashem gave him. And it further says, so basically, he wrote what he had initially at Har Sinai. And then later it says, Aval divrei haomer, Torah chatuma natno. Nichtav hakol b'shanat ha'arba'im. So essentially, the entire Torah itself, the entire text of the Torah, he wrote before he passed away. Basically meaning that in the last, after the 40 years of being the Midbar, before Am Yisrael were built to go to the land of Israel. So essentially, we have two different sources, and this is repeated amongst all the sources of ancient Jewish communities that of this information, that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah, and that essentially he didn't write it on his own. It was what the Creator told him to write. Exactly. If the Creator told him to write one thing here and write something a little bit different here, that's what he wrote. The Creator said, okay, when this happened, put it here, put it there. That's what he wrote. So essentially what this means is that every modern text that has been found to date, or exists today, whether it be a Torah scroll that exists amongst one community, whether it be the stuff found at the Dead Sea, the Dead Sea Scrolls, whether it be, like for example, the Aleppo Codex, the Leningrad Codex, all of these texts, they're essentially the continuation of copies that come from that original group of texts that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, those 13 copies that he made essentially of the information that the Creator gave him. And this is one of the reasons that when you look through all texts that are considered Torath Mosheh, they all are the same text. The only difference that exists amongst the texts, for example, is between Jewish texts, from, for example, in Yemen and certain parts of Europe. There modernly are about 13 differences, but most of those are the size of a letter here and there. Like one letter in this text is bigger than another one, and basically in a space here, a space there. One text has a letter at the end of the other that basically says the same thing. It's the same word, just has a little bit different meaning. But interestingly enough, it was found that in the communities in Europe that had a little bit different text than the ones in Yemen, an older text, one of the oldest texts found there, actually matches the one in Yemen. So essentially, after about 3,000 years, you're talking about at the most 13 differences happening in a text that has over 300,000 letters in it, and which is a pretty amazing feat given the fact that in most of Jewish history, most of these communities have very little contact with each other and not enough to go in and say, okay, here, let's change the text. So this is essentially Torath Mosheh. So again, Torath Mosheh is based upon the principle that all of the people of Israel heard and saw the Creator speak at Mount Sinai, and that at Mount Sinai, that is the singularity that created the people of Israel, and that there's no other text out there that explains it any way differently. There's no other oral tradition that explains it any way differently. That all of the creation of the people of Israel starts at this point. And that if you start from that point, that's the singularity. And there's no other information out there that gives a different singularity of how the whole thing started out. And again, the claim is that all the people saw and heard the Creator of all things speak in this way. And that he spoke and said that he would speak to Moshe Rabbeinu. And everybody agreed, you talk to Moshe Rabbeinu, we'll get whatever he says and we'll do whatever he says. And that both a written Torah was given and an oral Torah to explain the written Torah and how to make future decisions in the future based on the Torah were given all at Har Sinai. So now we can get to the point that we were going to be dealing with in this video. And well, actually now, this is the first part we're going to be dealing with now, deals with what is the common thread that you find amongst all Torath Mosheh communities. Every community that in some way or the other is defined as Torath Mosheh, if what I'm saying, what I was saying before is true, if everybody got the same thing based at Har Sinai, and basically, essentially, the Torah is being continued until this day for more than 3,000 years, you should find some common threads between all of these different Torath Mosheh communities. So let's look at those common threads. Well, when you look at the Torah text, for the most part, there's about only 13 differences between certain Torah texts, but modern research has actually shown that some of the differences that exist, for example, only exist in some of the more modern texts out of certain parts of Europe. But even those differences are even minor differences. Again, there's one, for example, difference where there's a letter that's used there that provides an O sound. But even without the letter, you can still pronounce it the exact same way. And even if you didn't, it doesn't change the meaning of the text. So there's no changes to the text that change the meaning. About the only text that has differences that change certain things is between the Samaritans and also Jewish texts and Karaite texts. But essentially, the Samaritans, there's only about 1,000 Samaritans nowadays, where there's like millions of Jews. And the Samaritans, when you look at their differences actually match what you could say is a commentary of the Torah, because everything that's in there, like all their differences, are agreed upon amongst all Jews who have a Torah scroll. Well, for example, they say, well, you can't call the Creator by human terms, like a man, for example. Well, Jews agree on that. But the reason why it's in Jewish text that way is because of the fact that, as the Rambam explains, that the creator of all things gave the Torah in the language of men so that men could understand it. Otherwise, we'd be talking about some metaphysical text that nobody could understand. So there's a common thread that you find amongst Jews and even Samaritans and Karaites about the fact that there's a Sefer Torah, and the Torah has a certain structure. It begins with Bereshit, goes to Shemot, Vayikro, Bimidbar, Devarim. There's nobody out there who's got it in a different order, and there's nobody who's got different stories in one area or different descriptions in one area, like placed somewhere else in the text. So that's one of the common threads. Another common thread that you find deals with, for example, let's say tzitziot. When you look at all Jewish communities, even with the differences in tying, which the Torah never says that there's only one way to tie a tzitzit, these are the tzitzit that are placed in the garment, all Torath Mosheh Jews agree that you place them on four-corner garments. So if you have at least a four-corner garment, you have to put tzitziot on it. The issue of how you tie the knots, okay, that's the Torah allows for those kind of variations to take place, because there's nothing wrong with like a cultural variation. But a person can recognize, when I see tzitzit from a different community, I know that they're wearing tzitzit. It isn't like I look at it and say, I don't know what that person's wearing, but when they're wearing it on their garment, it's identical in terms of how they're doing it. And that's why if you look at each of these examples, that are the main examples that are known modernly, that have come down through tradition, each one of these are tied to the exact same, to a garment in the exact same way at the end of the day. They're tied in a certain way. And when they're tied with techelet, the amount of techelet, the amount of strings is all the same. So everybody's using the same number of strings. They're just tying them differently, which is like a cultural variation which the Torah allows. There's no place in the Torah that says you must do every little mitzvah here exactly the same as everyone else. There are certain areas where we have to do it exactly the same. There's certain areas where it's perfectly permissible for people to develop the ways that they're going to do it. Another example is tefillin. Or in the Torah is called totafot. So a totafot, or tefillin, which is Aramaic, essentially when you look at the different types, whether it be the Yemenite type of tefillin, the Mizrahi or Sephardi tefillin, or Ashkenazi tefillin, you could easily recognize that these are tefillin. Even if you look and say, well, his sheen on the side of his is just a little bit different than the other guys, well, that's perfectly fine. There's no reason that they have to be exactly the same. And even still, you could just simply say, okay, well, over time, someone wrote their sheen a little bit differently. It's a different, type of writing, but it's basically the same. You can look at one and tell that the tefillin. If you look at all of these examples, the tefillin, and even bigger than that, when you look at tefillin from more than 2,000 years ago here, you could recognize the 4 boxes on the top, the same way that today you have 4 boxes on the top, so 4 separations for the different scriptures that go inside of them. And you could easily say, okay, well, that's also tefillin. It's smaller, and it's because it's more than 2,000 years old. Of course, it's going to look a little bit different because it's been through 2,000 years of wear and tear. But you could easily recognize this as the same as tefillin. And in fact, the tefillin that they find in the Dead Sea, which are more than 2,000 years old, which this one here is an example, they find that the same texts that are placed in those tefillin exist and are being done the same way today. So, for example, the order that you put them in, which some people say is like the Rambam Rashi version, is the same, was being done more than 2,000 years ago. The Rabbeinu Tam version was even being done 2,000 years ago. So what you essentially see is that Jews for more than 2,000 years, that's evidence that we've been doing the same thing that some Jews were doing 2,000 years ago. So again, when you jump across the Jewish spectrum and go through information that's been passed down from teacher to student and so on, and different rabbis, when you go to the most ancient Jewish communities and say Torath Mosheh, every single one of the people from those communities will know exactly what you're talking about. There's not like a situation where someone's going to say, Torath Mosheh, no, we don't keep that here, or, we're doing something different than that. Everybody would know what Torath Mosheh is, and that's because of the fact that even with the differences in location, even with the difference with certain traditions that grew up out of those locations, we're all dealing with Torath Mosheh coming from the same source. Now, one example of this is something that was written in a book called the Milchomot Hashem by Rabbi Yichya Kaifach. Now, Rabbi Kaifach basically says the following. He says, Me'ata tet azanacham ushma teshuvot. Torath Moshe emet. Lichvod Hashem Elohim emet. So what he basically says is he mentions Torath Mosheh Emet. So he, like we mentioned before, that Torath Mosheh, what it was, we described what it was, and he says to the honor of Hashem, the truth. So the issue here is one of the things about the Torah is the issue that it's the search for the truth and the propagation of the truth. That the Torah has to stand on the truth. The Torah can't be based upon something that's not true. Okay, so he further says about Torath Mosheh, which is marked in yellow here, of the Davak b'Torath Mosheh, Rabbeinu ala Shalom, shechatva v'pichtav v'shal peh. So he's saying that you have the written Torah and the oral Torah. So he says Torath Mosheh is the written Torah and the oral Torah. That's Torath Mosheh. So essentially what he continues to do is he says, okay, well these things, b'maki ba dayenu, b'mishnah, b'talmud, b'midrash, and also the writings of the Razal. So he's mentioning that, okay, basically you have the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrashim of different rabbis over time, and essentially what you have is that's like some of the elements of Torath Mosheh that was recorded. He further goes on to say that you have during the time of the Geonim, and also of Machasid Ba'ala Chovot Ha'alavot, that's like a certain text that like gets into the nature of Hashem, things like that. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and also Rabbi Saadia Gaon, Rambam, Bechavurav, also the writings of the Rambam, Rabbi Eliezer, Bejarmazi, Berokach, Sefer Mitzvot Hagadol, Sefer Mitzvot Katan. So he's giving you basically a background of where a lot of this information of Torath Mosheh can be found. And again, this is dealing with the fact that Torath Mosheh is the truth, and basically is the continuation of what was passed down at Har Sinai into the modern era. So he says that basically that all of this information is dealing with the truth. It is the reception that was received from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until the modern time. And basically it's the ancient understandings and ancient traditions that were received from the Creator himself. So the basic point here is what he's saying is that the essence of Torath Mosheh is not something that we invented in our time. It's not something that we just invented and created. It's not something of one location. That essentially Torath Mosheh comes from the Creator himself, and we are the continuation of those things. And there are of course traditions that pop up here and there, but the fact that what we are talking about is Torath Mosheh, Torath Emet, that it comes from Hashem, and that it isn't something we created ourselves, and that it's something that is passed down from generation to generation through these sources. So now that we've covered what Torath Mosheh is, we could deal with this issue that I mentioned before of what are Judaic religious movements. What is a Judaism style movement? And I think we'll see pretty soon that when we get into some of these movements, we're not dealing with Torath Mosheh anymore. We're simply dealing with the idea of religion. Religion being concepts of faith, concepts of people creating things that they want to say. And in some cases, people try to get away from Torath Mosheh to do something completely different, or even like what they would consider to be minorly different. But of course, when we deal with religion, we're not dealing with 100% Torath Mosheh. We could be easily dealing with somebody's ideas of what they want to do separate from what Torath Mosheh was and what it is. So one of the questions sometimes people ask was, well, why can't all the various Jewish movements get along? Well, one of the reasons is simple. And this graphic I use sometimes at work is a good example of it. Well, you have two sides trying to build, basically a train track somewhere. Well, all of a sudden they meet at the wrong spot. So one side, for example, is arguing, well, hey, my side is right. And the other side's arguing, no, my side's right. So you got people on the side staring, like, okay, well, I don't know what side is right. So who's right? That's where we get back into having to say, okay, well, what is the historical singularity that tells us what something is right and what something is wrong? And you can test this not just in like Torath Mosheh, you can do this in any form of history. Any form of history can be questioned in this way. So going back to Torath Mosheh, to the modern era, how do we get to the modern era with it? So let's start. The Torah was given at Har Sinai. There was a continuation during the time that there was an Israeli kingdom in the land of Israel. And they continued with Torath Mosheh until at a certain point people stopped doing it correctly for the most part, and then there was an exile that took place. During that time of exile, and right before the exile took place, there were a group of Jews who, according to legend, left and went into Arabia. So the modern day Jews that are of Yemen and Edom are descendants of those group of Jews. Now the Jews who either also left beforehand or stayed and were exiled during that original exile, the first exile, went into places like Syria, Iraq, and also some of them went into Yemen further. So then later on, we have another exile that took place after the return of some of those exiles from the first exile. And that second exile produced Jews who went to different parts of North Africa and Southern Europe. And those Jews became known as Sephardic Jews. The first group was, of course, Mizrahi Jews, which are mentioned in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and also in certain Jews in Yemen themselves are also known as to be different, both Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, but Yemenite Jews. But again, those same singularities, the singularity exists amongst all of them that we're going looking at here from the Torah from Mount Sinai. And then you also have a group of Jews after that, during that second exile, and after that second exile, he went further in northern Europe. Now, what's important, and I couldn't really represent this visually here, is that for the most part, Ashkenazi Jews are the result of Sephardic Jews, meaning Jews who made it to North Africa and Southern Europe, who went further north. So that's one of the things that people sometimes get mixed up about when they say, well, they're called Ashkenazi Jews. When the Torah, it mentions that Ashkenaz was a place in north. Well, that simply means that this is where they ended up when they went further north. So those Jews are simply just known as Ashkenazi Jews because they are Jews who left Southern Europe and went further north into the north. So when we get into these various movements, we're dealing all with Torath Mosheh. All of these groups to this day, those who keep Torath Mosheh exist to this day. But now you also have to deal with the groups who have kind of an unclear origin, and that is also the Jews of Ethiopia as well as various lost tribes that exist. That doesn't mean that they don't have a Jewish ancestry. It just means that historically speaking, it's just unclear because for the most part, there's not a written history that goes through and explains it in full detail. So that, again, that doesn't mean that they don't exist, but they're nowadays, now that they're in Israel, most of these people are following Torath Mosheh in one way or the other, or some of them have left Torath Mosheh because of the fact that Israel is a secular nation, and there's a big push to be secular. So now let's deal with the way with breakaway movements away from Torath Mosheh. When we deal with that, what we have to recognize is that at a certain point, certain groups of Ashkenazi Jews decided that they didn't want to have anything to do with the Torath Mosheh. They wanted to remain Jewish, they wanted to be culturally Jewish, but in terms of keeping Torath Mosheh, that wasn't the interest. You have two movements today for that, for example, are mostly known for this, and that's the Reform and Conservative now. Again, the important issue here is that when you're dealing with the Reform movement, they do not define themselves as Torath Mosheh. I mean, that's not me making that up. If you look at information on their websites, they don't claim to be Torath Mosheh. When you look at conservative movement, the same thing. I've looked at a couple of information trying to understand exactly how they define themselves, but for the most part, I did not find anyone who was conservative saying that they follow Torath Mosheh. Because again, we define what Torath Mosheh is. In order to be saying that you're following that, you would have to pass through this historical branch that we provided here and showing that everything you're doing comes directly from the time of the Torah until the modern era, and that you're doing it for the reasons that the Torah gave and for the reasons that Hashem gave. So let's deal with this issue of where these different movements came from. And you predominantly find these movements really amongst Ashkenazi Jews. There's a lot of historical discussion about that, and for the most part, supposedly, according to most accounts, what it comes from is the time when there were Jews who wanted to be in Germany as well as in France, wanted to be more part of those German and French societies by showing that, look, we're Jewish, but we're still German like you, or French like you. And unfortunately, that didn't go over very well for the most part at a certain point. But to this day, there still are Reformed Jews. There's still conservative Jews. And you also have movements that branch out of those movements. And the group of Jews, of Ashkenazi Jews who kept practicing Torath Mosheh or kept keeping it, are usually known today as being Orthodox or Haredi, for the most part. But then you also have, amongst the kind of what you could say breakaway movements from away from Torath Mosheh, you have Conservadox, which I think is some form of conservative movement, but they have their own kind of thing. From the Reform, you have the Humanist movement as well as the Reconstructionists. And I won't get into exactly what they are because again, it's not as important for this to just define them, 100%. As far as I'm concerned, they define themselves. It's not my job to define them. They define themselves. Now, even to this day, you have amongst Orthodox Jews, amongst the Ashkenazi Jews who were Orthodox and Haredi, you have breakaway movements there. Today, for the most part, you have Orthodox Haredi and various types of Haredi, various types of Orthodox, and various types of modern Orthodox. But in terms of them, there's other breakaway movements for them too. And I don't want to get into trying to discuss who all these groups are because in some cases it becomes very bogged down trying to define them. But I'll just call them ortho something. There's a lot of ortho somethings nowadays that are breakaways that if you tried to go back and say, can they be considered Torath Mosheh? They would never define themselves strictly and first and foremost as Torath Mosheh. They would identify themselves as being Orthodox something or Judaism something. But they would never, for example, come out and say, we are Torath Mosheh. That's what we hold by. So that's the thing to consider there. So kind of to sum up some of this, if we were to deal with just the kind of the core group of breakaway movements that are, are types of Judaism, that kind of are not really Torath Mosheh, not because I'm saying so, not because of what they do, but even though you could say because of some of the practices, they're not Torath Mosheh, historically Torath Mosheh, but partially because they don't define themselves as Torath Mosheh. And I think that's the thing to understand here. It's not that I'm saying, hey, I'm trying to beat up on the Reform movement, the Conservative movement. It's just that if you're dealing with Torath Mosheh, they don't define themselves that way. Torath Mosheh, people define themselves as being, first of all, that Hashem spoke to all of Am Yisrael at Mount Sinai. Well, first question you have to ask yourself, if that's Torath Mosheh and the Reform movement says, no, that didn't happen, can the Reform movement be considered Torath Mosheh? Well, the answer would be no. The Reform movement, for example, is only 200 years old. So if they're only 200 years old, there was no predecessor to them. There was no Reform movement from 2,000 years ago who holds the exact same things that they hold by. Then you could also say, okay, well, you can't really say that they're historically Torath Mosheh. You could just simply say they're the Reform movement of Judaism, meaning the religion of Judaism, the modern concept of religion, and Judaism, the Reform movement. The same thing with the conservative. They're like, a little bit less than 200 years old. And everywhere I've looked in terms of their information, I don't see them defining themselves as Torath Mosheh. And that also goes into, well, what do they practice? How old are they? Can they be claimed to be an ancient form of Torath Mosheh? Well, not really. They're a form of Judaism. They're a Jewish movement. The next thing is Torath Mosheh people claim to be Torath Mosheh. I mean, there's some people who, if you were to ask them, they would tell them firsthand. But if you were to say Torath Mosheh, do you follow it? They would understand what you mean and say yes. In terms of the Masorah, of what they do, Torah and Tanakh is derived from a Masorah. The Reform movement doesn't really have a Masorah because they're only 200 years old. They only have what goes back 200 years ago to the present. The same with the Conservative movement. They use certain Torath Mosheh and Masorahs, but they can't really claim that it's like they're the correct representation of it. They just simply say we're a movement, the Conservative movement, that's what we are. And also, when you look at it, Torath Mosheh communities can be found all over the world. Wherever Jews were spread, dispersed to, you can find Torath Mosheh, groups there of people who keep Torath Mosheh. But when you look at both the Reform and the Conservative, you don't find them everywhere. For example, you don't find a Reform movement or a Conservative movement in Yemen. There's no such thing as that. All the movements that did exist there were all Jews who kept Torath Mosheh, both sides. When you go to Morocco, there was no Reform movement in Morocco. The same thing, there's no Conservative movement from Morocco. Algeria, there's no such movement. Iraq, all of the most ancient Jewish communities, there's no such thing as a Reform movement, a Conservative movement. But that doesn't mean that throughout history you haven't had Reform-minded people or Conservative-minded people, but those people stayed within the same Torath Mosheh community as those who were keeping Torath Mosheh correctly. So that means that there was no movement. Everybody just stayed in the community. You didn't agree with someone and you didn't want to practice something, you still went to the same Bet Knesset or synagogue as someone who did keep it. Even in Israel today, for the most part, even Jews who are secular will still go back to their family synagogues before they'll join a movement, for example. There are some who will join a movement, but for the most part, they're not joining movements. They'll just kind of simply say, okay, well, I have a itch of Torah that I'm going to scratch today, or I'm going to go to my father's Bet Knesset, my mother's Bet Knesset, my family's Bet Knesset, my family's synagogue. That's where I'm going to go to practice this little thing that I want to practice just today. So when we get into this issue of investigating the historical truth of something, we always have to say whether it's ancient, authentic, and authoritative. So if we're dealing with something that deals with the Torah and what was given, and we're dealing with the issue of what's Torath Mosheh and where the movements come from, this is the way we have to look at it. We have to look back and say, well, what's the most ancient source for this? What's the most authentic and authoritative source for this? And once we do that, we can understand how these things come about. And that's my video today about how these movements get started. Now, again, I'm not trying to beat up on anybody's whatever movement. People can do whatever they want as far as I'm concerned. At the end of the day, if you're going to say that you're Torath Mosheh means something. That's where I say it's not a religious movement. It's about the issue of what is the truth of ancient, authentic, and authoritative sources, dealing with that and living a life based on those things. So that's my video today. And this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. So I hope you have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.